Dr. Marshal Edgar and Minnie Gillrie. In 1953, an aged Dr. M.E. Gillrie got in his car and drove to the Hamilton General Hospital where he checked himself in. He laid in his hospital bed for less than a day, then closed his eyes and passed away. None of his 6 children or 3 grandchildren were by his side when he took his last breath. Dr. Gillrie had not always been alone. In fact, he had spent the majority of his life surrounded by family and friends. A well-respected doctor and father, he was the last of 7 children born to Andrew and Esther Gillrie. He arrived in the world on a brisk October morning in 1862 in the small town of Holland's Landing, Ontario. The Canadian wilderness of 1862 was hard on pioneer families. 3 of Marshal's older siblings died before their 9th birthday. His surviving siblings were Arabella, Henry, and Albert. Like his father and grandfather, Marshal became a carpenter. Farmers in the area would hire Marshal to supervise barn raisings. Sometimes he would have 100 men come to help work, but Marshal would be the only man paid by the farmer because he was the master carpenter. On raising day, Marshal would divide them into 2 gangs, each led by an experienced captain, and get a race going to see which group would have their job done first. The 1880s were a time of change for the settlers of Canada. The Canadian Pacific Railroad was under construction. More people came to Canada and needed houses to live in along the railroad. Marshal, in his early 20s, decided to travel to Manitoba to earn money building houses during the hot summers. On an especially hot day, Marshal found himself shingling a roof under the glaring sun and decided the construction business was not the life for him. He decided not to earn a living by the sweat of his brow, so at the end of the building season, he returned to Drayton, Ontario, to spend the winter helping his brother Henry Walsingham Gillrie on the bush farm. Marshal's Aunt Eliza Gillrie had purchased some land which needed clearing. They called the land the work or bush farm because it would take a lot of work to clear the land for planting. Marshal and Henry went out each day to chop down trees and pull stumps at the work farm. William Walsingham Gillrie, the son of Henry, remembers a conversation he heard at the supper table after his father and Marshal returned home after spending the day at the work farm. It was winter time and the weather had been especially cold for the past 3 days. Marshal looked across the supper table that night and announced that farming and carpentry was not the life for him. He had decided to go back to school and get an education. Even though he had never finished the 8th grade, Marshal Edgar Gillrie went back to school at age 28 and passed his senior matriculation in only 1 year. After passing, he left for Toronto to attend more school and received degrees from Victoria College in 1888 and the University of Toronto in 1889, where he became a doctor. Dr. Gillrie's first office was in St. Mary's, Ontario, where he practiced for 4 years. Marshal enjoyed the company of his cousins, Sussex Gillrie and Mary Elizabeth Gillrie, who he called Minnie. Eventually, he and Minnie married on the 1st of January in 1889. Everyone knew there could be serious problems with the children of first cousins. Marshal was a doctor and was fully aware of the risks. Many years later he said that Mary was the only girl he ever loved, so he married her in spite of the dangers. Dr. Gillrie was a typical country doctor. The farmers paid him what they could. Sometimes they paid him money, but sometimes they paid him with produce from their farms. In the wintertime he used a horse and sleigh to visit his patients. The great distances he traveled soon taught him he would never get rich being a country doctor. A friend told him that doctors in the cities made more money, so Marshal and Minnie packed up and moved to Hamilton, Ontario. When they arrived in Hamilton, the main streets were paved with wooden blocks and lit by gaslight. Dr. Gillrie's new office was in a Jewish neighborhood where he enjoyed immediate success. In a newspaper interview given on October 16, 1952, he said, "I was a general practitioner. That means I had to go everywhere. It's still like that with many present-day doctors, but in my case it wasn't so easy getting there, or so comfortable." At first, Marshal solved the problem of transportation by riding a bicycle from his Herkimer Street office to his patients' homes. Soon, though, he had the money to replace his bicycle with a horse and buggy so he could get to his patients faster. Ralph Connor, the brother-in-law of Marshal's son, told a story of being with Marshal in a store. Marshal recognized a girl when he heard her name. He went up to the girl and announced to her that he had brought her into the world. The girl turned to him and said she would have arrived whether he was there or not. Sometimes babies would come too quickly, so Marshal charged $25 to deliver a baby, but only $15 if the baby got there before he did. Bicycles were the new thing in the 189Os and many people participated in races and long bike rides. Marshal once set the 100-mile record in a round-trip race from Hamilton to Niagara Falls and back. He was so enthusiastic that he would ride his bike from Hamilton to Sussex Gillrie's farm in Drayton, a distance of 55 miles. Marshal even convinced his cousin, Sussex Gillrie, to buy a bike and go on a so-mile ride with him. After the ride, Sussex could not walk for a week. Marshal and Minnie were the first Gillries to enjoy an affluent lifestyle. Marshal built a large home for his family which was called Kingsway at 255 King Street. The house was later torn down in the 195Os, but a picture of it survives today. In 1910, 4 years after he moved to his King Street address, Marshal was the second person to own a Ford automobile in Hamilton, Ontario. Marshal shared his wealth by paying for the electricity bill to put electricity on the farms in Drayton. Dr. Gillrie was described as a handsome man, standing over 6 feet tall. He was a born leader and was elected to be the president of the Hamilton Academy of Medicine in 1916. During his career, he served in all of the different elected offices for the Academy. He also loved to play chess and passed the game to many nieces, nephews, and grandchildren, and served as the president of the Hamilton Chess Club for many years. Marshal and Minnie had 6 children. They were Frederick, Norman, Edith, Muriel, Bessie, and Franklin. Norman died soon after birth, and Edith died at the age of 2, but the rest of the children survived to adulthood. Dr. David Bruce Gillrie, Marshal's nephew, was another doctor in the family. These are some of the memories he shared of Dr. Marshal Gillrie, his wife Minnie, and their 4 surviving children. A story Bruce Gillrie liked to tell about Marshal and Minnie involved a time when he was riding in the back seat of their car. Marshal and Minnie were generally very formal and serious people, but one day while they were driving down a road, Marshal spotted a railroad crossing, put the gas pedal to the floor, and sailed up and over the railroad bed. He landed so hard on the other side that Minnie came out of her seat and smacked her head hard on the roof of the car. The kids loved the ride and were laughing when Minnie suddenly turned to Marshal and punched him in the side of the head without saying a word. Nothing had to be said, he just kept driving down the road. Bruce Gillrie also told the story of how Marshal Gillrie dealt with the abusive husband of one of his sisters. Me, as he was called, received word that his sister was being ill-treated by her husband, so me quickly went to straighten out the man. No one ever said what he did to get the man's attention, but the abuse stopped immediately and never happened again. When Marshal and Minnie's family would visit the David Sussex Gillrie farm, their girls, Muriel and Bessie, would also go next door and visit their uncle's family on the Farrow farm. According to Bruce Gillrie, Margaret Farrow was a cripple and used 2 canes. Bessie Gillrie was a very lovely girl, in Bruce's words, and she could play the piano by ear. She was always playing the piano in the parlor of the David Sussex farm. Bruce described Muriel as a girl full of beans, which means she had lots of energy and enthusiasm. Their brother, Frank, was also musical. He played the traps, which is a name for the drums. One day Bruce and Marshal Gillrie were standing at the side of Marshal's house when they heard a window open, looked up, and saw a pair of feet appear. Frank, unlike his brother, Frederick, hated schoolwork. So, instead of doing his math homework like he was supposed to, Frank was trying to escape. Frank didn't know that Marshal and Bruce had seen him, so they slipped out of sight and reappeared as soon as Frank lighted on the ground. Bruce Gillrie said that Marshal and Minnie were cursed because they were first cousins. All 4 of their surviving children ended up with serious health problems. Muriel died of a blood disorder caused by a congenital heart problem she had since birth. The heart problem had developed into a malignant heart valve disease. She lingered for a long time before she died. Her father made sure she had a private nurse at her bedside throughout her illness. Muriel died the 20th of May, 1916 at the age of 19. Bruce Gillrie said, Marshal was a tough man but he took her death very badly. Bessie also had a weak constitution and was unfortunately soon to follow. Bessie had taken a job as a relief teacher in Dundas, Ontario, where she contracted typhoid fever from bad well water. Bessie lingered for many days with her fever rising and falling. Marshal tried every treatment he knew to save her, but was not successful. Bessie died at the age of 20 on the 25th of May in 1923, only 7 years after her sister, Muriel. Franklin was a reporter at the Hamilton Herald, a local newspaper. According to Bruce Gillrie, Franklin fell in love with a dance hall girl. They eloped and ran off to Florida. Marshall, upon learning what his son had done, went to Florida, ended the relationship, and brought his son home. Many years later, in 2004, Evelyn Gillrie received an email saying that a Betty Gillrie had died. Evelyn was unsure of who Betty Gillrie was, but further research found a marriage record between Franklin Victor Gillrie and Beatrice Lule Rimal in 1922, which proves Franklin really had married. The marriage was short-lived for two reasons. The first reason was that Franklin was spirited away by his father. The second reason was that Franklin became gravely ill with tuberculosis the same year he was married. He had been exposed the same year Bessie died, when Marshal Gillrie brought a patient home for Christmas from the Hamilton Sanitarium who suffered from tuberculosis. According to Dr. Bruce Gillrie, who was interviewed in 1979, Marshall took his son to the Hamilton Sanitarium Hospital where they punctured his lung and collapsed it to give it a chance to heal. All efforts failed and Franklin Victor Gillrie died July 1924 at the age of 24. His sister-in-law, Mary Margaret, claimed that Franklin committed suicide, although that was not recorded on the death certificate. Perhaps the failed marriage, death of his sister and the debilitating disease was more than he could bear. By 1923 Marshall and Minnie had one surviving child, their eldest son Frederick Russell Gillrie. Frederick followed in his father's footsteps and became a doctor. He attended the Toronto Medical School and later specialized in communicable diseases. He married Mary Margaret Bauer in 1918 and they had 3 children. Frederick Russell suffered from Bright's disease, chronic inflammation of the kidneys also known as nephritis, which finally took his life in 1933 at age 43. His parents, Marshall and Minnie, were in their 70s when Frederick died, having outlived all of their children. In 1936 Frederick's widow purchased some land in Huntsville, Ontario. There she invited friends and relatives to build cottages on the property. They called the property the Resort Belvedere, Gazebo, Cottages because there was a gazebo on the property. Marshall and Minnie built a beautiful cottage there and called it the Kingsdale. A rare piece of film still exists showing Marshall and Minnie at the cottages in Huntsville. Before he died, Frederick Russell Gillrie and Mary Elizabeth Bauer had 3 children, giving Marshall and Minnie 3 grandchildren. The grandchildren did not see much of their grandfather, but still have memories of them. In a taped interview, their grandson, Bauer Gillrie, spoke of the relationship between Marshall and Minnie. Grandma ruled the roost. Grandpa would come home from church on Sunday and say he had a rough week and was going to have a good Sunday meal and then relax. An hour later she would have him driving to Drayton to visit the relatives. Marshal Gillrie had a tradition of entertaining the whole Gillrie clan at Christmas. His daughter, Bessie, would play the piano, making the holiday full of music. It was at these festive Christmas parties that Bruce Gillrie remembered meeting Marshall's grandchildren in the early 1900s. During World War II, the Canadian government housed officers in private homes. Marshall and Minnie's home was chosen to help house officers, so they ended up with many house guests. At the end of the war, Ralph Connor, F.R. Gillrie's nephew, who was posted in Hamilton, shared his memories about Marshall in a 2004 interview. Marshal Edgar Gillrie was called Old Doc, he said. Doc was always racing the car engine because he was as deaf as a post. He had a deal with another doctor. They would both sign off on their health certificates so they could keep practicing medicine. Ralph also remembered being in the Gillries' living room when he heard a noise coming from a closet under the stairs. Eventually he got up to investigate. Upon opening the closet door he was surprised to find a man living in it. Bauer Gillrie, M.E. Gillrie's grandson, remembered his grandmother, Minnie, suffered from rheumatoid arthritis. Later in her life, she was in constant pain, so every day Marshall would give her a shot of morphine, which was a common medication for pain relief. Minnie died on the 13th of October in 1944. Marshal Gillrie married again after his wife, Minnie, died. His second wife was Sarah Lavina McLaughlin, the widow of his cousin David Sussex Gillrie. Even later in his life, McGillrie was always in the public eye. One of his last official duties was to officiate at the last public hanging held behind the Wentworth County Courthouse on Jackson Street in Hamilton. Donald Bauer Gillrie thought his grandfather as a tough old bird. He says he ate like a bird, was gaunt, and had a Roman nose. Marshal lived till he was 91. Donald remembers that on June 30, 1954, his grandfather went into the hospital on a Sunday night and was dead on Tuesday. That was the only time he was ever in the hospital. Donald said that his grandfather, Marshal, passed away too quickly for any of his grandchildren to visit his bedside. Marshal Edgar Gillrie outlived his own children by over 20 years. He was interred at the Hamilton Cemetery on Barton Street with his wife and children. Marshal was one of the most colorful members of the Gillrie family. His second wife passed her final years on the Hillborn farm in Drayton, Ontario. She passed away June 18, 1961.